the last video I explained the rules of Blooms, an abstract game by Nick Bentley, and gave my thoughts. But this is not going to be a review channel. Instead, I'm going to try and drill down into tactics and strategy and look at how a game plays in bite-sized chunks. So today, we're going to go a little bit further than the last video and talk about the basic tactics of Blooms, degrees of freedom, eyes, invulnerable Blooms, and good endgame play, and illustrate by showing you examples of it being done, how not to blunder at these things. I'm going to use a specific game between myself as the cold pieces and Suet63, one of the top 10 board game arena players, as the warm pieces. The game begins in a fairly typical fashion, with the cold player using both of their colours to try and surround one of the opponent's Blooms, while warm attempts to surround the attacking pieces. In many games, the outcome of this early tussle is decisive for the whole game. To understand these sorts of positions, you need to count the number of degrees of freedom that each Bloom has. That is, how many adjacent spaces it could grow into. I think Go players call these liberties, but in my head I think of them as degrees of freedom. The red Bloom has 5, and the attacking blue Bloom has 4. Critical thing is that neither of them can be captured on the next turn because a player can only play 2 pieces on their turn and so can only remove 2 of those degrees of freedom. Any Bloom with more than 2 is safe for at least 1 turn. On the other hand, any piece that has 2 or fewer is vulnerable. And in this particular case, we arrive at a situation where the red Bloom has only 2 degrees of freedom and the blue has 3. Blue is still safe, but the red is vulnerable. It's going to be captured in the next few turns. The critical thing, like all games, is not simply to know this, but to kind of internalize it so that you don't end up forgetting about it at the critical moment. And we're now going to watch Cold do exactly that. The blue Bloom has 4 degrees of freedom, and the cold player is going to fill in 2 of them, leaving it to be captured on the next turn. So, how do you protect your Blooms from being captured? Well, that requires another concept, which we will call eyes. Let us move forward to Cold forming their first eye with the black pieces. B4 and C4 are empty spaces entirely surrounded by cold pieces. They form an eye. The critical thing that makes them an eye is that to capture any of the pieces surrounding the eye, in this case that actually consists of 3 different Blooms, the warm player must completely fill it, which means that the attacking pieces will have no degrees of freedom. If they don't succeed in capturing some of the surrounding pieces, they will themselves be captured when it's the cold player's turn. As a general rule, you can sacrifice pieces to reduce any eye to a single hex, and we'll see an example of that a bit later in the game. 1 eye will not protect your Bloom. Neither will 2 eyes. The opponent can play 2 pieces, so they can fill 2 eyes simultaneously. To render a Bloom invulnerable, you need to form 3 eyes. And what we're seeing here is Cold doing that over the next few turns. There is now an eye at A2, an eye at B4, C4, and an eye at D7. The black Bloom, which connects to all of these eyes, is now invulnerable. The small blue Blooms that make up little bits of the thing are not. They can still be captured. The tactics of the game require you not just to form eyes, but to also recognise them. If you attack a Bloom with 3 eyes, you're just throwing points away. This position, I will explain why in a moment, is a 1 position for warm, but they are about to blunder it away by attacking the black Bloom. You might be thinking, as the warm player did, that you can capture the blue pieces to destroy the eyes, but that does not work. When warm attacks the eye at D7 and captures the blue piece, cold just replaces it with a black piece. We now get to see how 2 eyes is not a protection in its own right, because that's all the red bloom has in the bottom. Cold fills in one space, reducing it to 2 degrees of freedom. And now, even if the warm player captures that piece, they will have to fill in a space to do it, and there will still only be 2 degrees of freedom. The red bloom will be captured in the next round. Finally, it's worth saying a little bit about the endgame and why I said earlier that this was a one game for the warm player. This is not an uncommon endgame position. Both players have 1 or more large blooms which have 3 eyes and so are invulnerable. Technically, the yellow bloom only has 1 eye, but trust me that it can definitely form 2 more if it needs to. If neither player reaches the target number of captures by this stage, then ultimately the players are forced to sacrifice pieces by playing them in the opponent's eyes. When that happens, controlling empty space you can fill in is like having points in hand. So once the exchange in the bottom right finished and the blue and the red piece has been captured, the overall effect will be that Cold will have a lead of about 4 points, likely a score of somewhere around 17 to 19. Not quite the 20 they need to actually win. And then they have very few opportunities to play. Black piece at C4 or B4, shrinking but keeping the eye. And after that, they have no choice but to play pieces where the warm player can capture them. By contrast, Warm can play up to 9 yellow pieces in that large expanse of empty territory they control. All the while with the Cold player sacrificing 1 piece and thus 1 point every round and slowly eroding their lead. With 8 points worth of empty space versus Cold's 4-point lead, the game should ultimately tip over and be a win for Warm. In this case, Cold actually won the game. 2 reasons. The obvious one is that Warm blundered and failed to spot the 3 eyes. They sacrificed pieces unnecessarily, allowing the Cold player to edge over 20 points. The other reason is that the Cold player spotted that this was an endgame position much earlier. And so if you look back through the video, you'll see that the Cold player starts to play just 1 piece each turn, dragging out that time before they have to start making sacrificial plays. While Warm continued to play 2 pieces a turn, long after the red pieces were useful. As I commented in the last video, Blooms does not have a very interesting endgame, but recognising when it arrives and slowing your tempo to match may tip a game in your favour. So try and remember these 3 concepts. 2 degrees of freedom bad, 3 degrees of freedom good. Try to form eyes. Try to form 3 of them. Recognise when your opponent has formed 3 eyes and don't throw your pieces away trying to attack a position you cannot actually capture. And when the endgame arrives, give yourself time by slowing your tempo. Every piece you don't place in that endgame is a point.